You're listening to the FAI INKWELL. This podcast is produced by Frontier Alliance International, making our weekly published articles available in audio format. Explore all citations and footnotes in the original document and get more information about FAI at fai.online. Thanks for listening.
Hey friends, Stephanie Quick here, and I am reading an article for FAI called Gaza, Goliath, Gospel, Living in a World Too Good at War. This article is available in writing at fai.online, where you can check references. There's a few videos that are referred to here. You can click through and watch the videos and get into the source passages that I cite and read them for yourselves and pray through them with the Lord. That said, I'll start reading the article now. I took the simpler road home today and found myself driving through the smoke of wildfires started by Hezbollah rockets. It was on a stretch of highway with no possibility of turning around unless you want to drive into oncoming traffic. I passed one empty, thankfully, car that had clearly been hit, and I drove a little faster. Last week, we had to put out fires on the edge of our village that started the same way, Hezbollah rockets. Yesterday, I visited the site of the Nova Festival and adjacent car yard memorial for the third time in 2 months. I've been to Auschwitz. I've been to Dachau. The Nova field is, to me personally, the heaviest place I've ever stood. And the car yard, where Israel has collected the vehicles that were used and abused on October 7th, is excruciating. If I'm honest, I find my capacity waning. It would be too much to try and survey every war and battle or bloodthirsty campaign since Cain first stained his hands with his brother's life. But just within my own experience, I am getting tired of war. Assad's quiet permission to continue assaulting his own Syrian civilians with chemical weapons and barrel bombs frustrates me, to put it gently. The catastrophic collapse of Afghanistan in August 2021 nearly did me in. Erdogan's recent libellous propaganda against Israel, accusing the Jewish state of aiming to take over Turkey after it polishes the Gaza Strip, after Erdogan himself has spent years literally publishing maps of all the ground that he plans to conquer for the caliphate, including Israel. To then turn that on Israel and accuse Israel of that ambition almost made me laugh with his brazen, delusional hypocrisy. But I've lived in Kurdish villages where his jets would fly over at night. Can the Columbia mob advocate a bit for the Kurds he's been killing since Saddam's been missing from the job? Will Macklemore write a more accurate song for the world's largest stateless people group? But gone are the days of the battlefields. We live in the era of urban warfare, terrorist attacks, and intifadas. In the 19 years Hamas has held Gaza, they've built a subterranean level, an underground Gaza, with tunnels feeding in and out of every apartment, house, office, and hospital above ground. That's a new kind of strategy, certainly shared by the variety of Iranian proxies entrenched along Israel's borders. What we saw on October 7th wasn't exactly new. Pagan mobs have raped and pillaged for time immemorial. Muhammad relied on it as a war tactic, and every jihadi cult has emulated him since. But the pride and confidence to include GoPros was certainly new. Even Putin is careful to not do that. But it was even bait to engage in a convoluted game of cat and mouse in the Hamas hellhole that is now the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah is postured for their turn, lobbing barrages of rockets at civilians to either take lives or start fires in the meantime. I want a world without war. I want us to stop learning how to do it so well. Allow me to pivot to 1 Samuel 17. It would be trite and simplistic to quote David and Goliath in light of the Gaza war because Goliath was a Philistine from Gaza. That's not what I'm doing here. Philistines were not Arab, and therefore they are not the ethnic ancestors of the Arabs now living in the Gaza Strip. But some would suggest and have suggested that since the fruition of the Zionist dreams and the miraculous reestablishment of the State of Israel in 1948, this particular story has flipped the script. Voices like those gathering for Christ at the checkpoint in Bethlehem this weekend have claimed that Israel has become such a juggernaut apartheid aggressor against Palestinian Arabs that the nation once governed by this shepherd king named David has in fact become the violent giant. Deductively, a social justice-centric hermeneutic like this leads us to conclude that God will always fight for and side with the underdog, whoever we decide the underdog is. He is, to be sure, the father of the fatherless and the tireless advocate for the poor and needy, and the one who will defend the defenseless and vindicate all victims. This is just who he is. This is what he does and what he will do in fullness in the day of the Lord and the reign of King Jesus. The story of David and Goliath actually confirms this, but not in validation of a social justice liberation theology. This episode of David's life is sandwiched in between formational events and issues in his young adulthood. In the chapter prior, he is anointed by the prophet Samuel before his entire family to be king over the entire nation, and then summoned to play his instrument as a means of deliverance for the demon-afflicted King Saul. In the chapter following, the technical heir to what is now David's inheritance, Jonathan, is knit to David in an intercessory solidarity. By contrast, Saul's jealousy of David then begins to form and take root, and this will ultimately lay the groundwork for Saul's own death and demise. And in the midst of all of these stories, David is sent on a lunch run for his big brother serving at the war front in Israel's defense against the Philistines. You're likely familiar with the story. The nation of Abraham's promised descendants are shivering under the intimidating shadow of one particular Philistine who is particularly large and particularly strong. He makes an offer. Fight him and win, and the nation is free to go. Fight him and lose, and the nation forged in the Exodus will once again return to slavery. Then David is incredulous. He says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" This is not a patriotic boast. David is not leveraging God's eternal purposes through his own nationalistic interpretation of current events. His confidence isn't in Israel at all. His confidence is in the covenant, the one evidenced by circumcision. And here was an uncircumcised man, one that Paul would describe in Ephesians 2 as alien from the covenant, threatening to undo the Exodus as though he had a right or the strength required to re-enslave the nation of Israel and subvert the success of Joshua's military campaign under the leadership of the Lord of hosts. Remember that Joshua himself was confronted with the fact that God does not take sides. The Lord alone is the line of demarcation. All our collisions are guilt-ridden on all parts and parties because all have fallen short, all have sinned. But his sovereign and strategic eternal purposes are our salvation, so that all nations of the earth would be blessed through the covenant that was promised and purchased the blessing. David's confidence in the covenant was met with the hand of him who will make the first last and the last first. And one simple stone neutralized and eliminated the principal threat against the covenantal nation. He then took the head of the Gentile who so confidently boasted against the branches just a few minutes prior and took it to Jerusalem, which at that point was nothing to write home about. Prior to this story, we're only told of Abram's encounter with Melchizedek, who was king of Salem, king of Jerusalem, right before, that's the end of Genesis 14. That's right before the Lord cut the everlasting covenant with Abram in Genesis 15. Yet this was enough for David, who spent his adolescence mining the things of God while guarding his father's sheep, to know that Jerusalem is inextricably knit to the everlasting covenant. So when he won the fight with the covenant-slandering Gentile, he marked it by planting the head of Goliath in the soil of the city of the great king. Years later, when David himself was crowned over the nation, he relocated the capital city of Israel to Jerusalem and devoted his life to building the house of the Lord. Just as an aside, I think it's worth pointing out, there was something in David that recognized and honored the covenant that Saul did not see. Saul's headquarters were in Gibeah. He didn't honor or recognize Jerusalem. But David did, and David is the one who's promised to have a king on his throne forever. So returning to the article, David's son Solomon oversaw the architectural engineering, completion, and dedication of the Second Temple. He literally saw the presence of the Lord dwell manifest there. Our hope is in the return of the manifest presence of the Lord to Jerusalem, when the great King rules from his city and all nations of the earth are living in the fullness of the blessing that was entrusted to and stewarded by the nation of Israel. Imagine what could have happened if Goliath had instead bowed before the people of the covenant and blessed them. His head likely would not have been buried in the soil as a symbol, his whereabouts now known only to God. But what if he had entrusted himself to the name of the Lord of hosts, who has promised us a day wherein the nations will learn war no more, when all our swords and slings and AK-47s will be melted down to make farm equipment, and to make enough farm equipment needed to clean up the mess that we have made of things. This is our only hope. My prayer is that we would not only not spend our days reiterating Goliath's boast, but that the, quote, people of the cross, and I'm borrowing that language from Jihadi John of ISIS, because that's who he dedicated the video to, as he filmed he and 20 of his colleagues beheading 21 Coptic martyrs kidnapped from Egypt on the shores of Libya. And even then, you can see the ethics of ISIS are no different from Hamas, because jihadis are going to jihad. But he dedicated that video to the people of the cross. And that is, in fact, what we should be known as. My prayer is that the people of the cross would walk the narrow road of the cruciform and bring the good news of the kingdom soon to be restored to Israel, to the Goliaths of our day, and even literally to Gaza, just as we were commanded to do. And may we not love our lives even unto death. Maranatha.
Thank you for listening to the FAI INKWELL. This podcast is part of our commitment to resource those who have the gospel as we prioritize reaching those who do not have the gospel. For more information about our ministry and pioneering initiatives among the unreached and unengaged, download the FAI app or visit us at fai.online. Maranatha.